Hello everyone, it's time to grab your favorite spot and settle in, because we've got another gripping story for you today on AGS Stories. Family dynamics can be complicated, especially when values and expectations collide. The bond between a parent and child is supposed to be built on love and understanding, but sometimes that bond can be tested in ways that leave lasting scars. Today on AGS Stories, we dive into the story of a young man who finds himself at odds with his father's harsh expectations. What happens when standing up for what you believe in means going against the very person who raised you? This one's a roller coaster of emotions: betrayal, defiance, and the courage to follow your own path. Let's see how it all unfolds. Ethan grew up in a small suburban town, raised by parents who couldn't have been more different. His mother, Anna, was the warm heart of the family, a social worker who believed deeply in kindness and helping others. She encouraged Ethan's compassion from a young age, always reminding him the smallest act of kindness can change someone's world. His father, Mark, was the opposite, a no-nonsense businessman who owned a luxury hotel in the city. Mark's philosophy was simple: hard work, success, and self-reliance. To him, helping others wasn't just pointless, it was weakness. Despite the tension between his parents' values, Ethan's childhood was mostly happy, thanks to his mom. She was his biggest supporter, always there to lift him up when Mark's criticisms got too harsh. But everything changed when Ethan was 16. His mother passed away unexpectedly, and suddenly the warmth in his home was gone. In the months that followed, Ethan's relationship with his father became strained. Mark, who was already distant, became even more controlling. He hated how much Ethan resembled his mother, not just in appearance but in his values. Mark would scoff every time Ethan did something selfless. "You'll get eaten alive in this world," he'd say. The tension came to a head one day when Ethan's friend Mia invited him to volunteer at a local homeless shelter. It was the first time Ethan had felt like himself in months. After school, he spent hours peeling potatoes, serving meals, and chatting with the people who came in. He was exhausted but fulfilled. When Ethan got home that evening, Mark was waiting for him. The moment he stepped through the door, Mark wrinkled his nose and demanded, "Why do you smell like a soup kitchen?" Ethan tried to explain, but Mark's anger flared. "You're wasting your time helping people who can't help themselves. From now on, you'll come straight to the hotel after school. You want to work? You'll work for me." Ethan felt crushed. His father's words stung, but more than that, they ignited a fire inside him. Ethan knew he couldn't let his father erase everything his mother had taught him. He had no idea that his decision to keep helping others would lead to revelations that would change his life forever. The first few days working at his father Mark's hotel were grueling for Ethan. He wasn't used to being in an environment where wealth and luxury were flaunted so openly. The guests treated him like part of the furniture, handing him their expensive luggage without so much as a thank you. He smiled politely, carried their bags, and worked hard, but the emptiness gnawed at him. His mother would have hated seeing him like this, stuck in a world that valued money over humanity. Mark, on the other hand, seemed pleased with himself. Every day, he made a point to remind Ethan of his opportunity. "This is real work," Mark would say, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're earning your way, learning how to deal with people who matter, not wasting time on people who can't even pay for a meal." Ethan would nod and stay quiet, but inside, he was seething. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Ethan sat in the small break room of the hotel, counting the tips he had collected throughout the day. He was shocked by how much money people were willing to give him for carrying a few bags. The guilt crept in almost immediately. He couldn't stop thinking about the shelter he had volunteered at. The tired faces of the people who came in, grateful for a hot meal and a kind word. The contrast between the lives of the hotel's wealthy guests and the people at the shelter was staggering. That weekend, while Mark was away on a business trip, Ethan made up his mind. He grabbed an envelope, stuffed it with all the tips he had saved, and headed straight to the shelter. When he walked through the doors, the familiar smell of warm soup and freshly baked bread greeted him. He felt at home for the first time in weeks. The shelter manager, a kind older woman named Linda, was surprised to see him. "Ethan, it's been a while," she said, smiling warmly. Ethan handed her the envelope without a word. When she opened it, her eyes widened. This is a lot of money, she said, her voice trembling. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. I can't volunteer right now, but I can still help, he said simply. Linda's gratitude was palpable, but before she could say more, a voice called out from the kitchen. Hey, Ethan, long time no see. Ethan turned to see Tyler, one of the shelter's regulars. Tyler was in his mid-40s, always cheerful despite his circumstances. He was chopping onions in the kitchen, a grin on his face. Come on, man, grab an apron. We're short-handed today. Ethan hesitated. He knew his father would lose his mind if he found out, but he couldn't resist. He grabbed an apron and joined Tyler in the kitchen. They worked side by side, laughing and sharing stories. Ethan learned that Tyler wasn't just a regular at the shelter, he was also one of its volunteers. Most people think we're just takers, Tyler said, wiping his hands on a towel. But we work hard to keep this place running. It's not much, but it's something. As the evening wound down, Tyler offered to buy Ethan a cup of coffee. They walked to a small cafe downtown and sat on a bench outside, sipping their drinks. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he could breathe. How'd you end up here? Ethan asked carefully. Tyler sighed. It's a long story. I used to have a great job, general manager at a fancy hotel. My brother and I even started our own business. We renovated an old building and turned it into the best hotel in the city. But things went south fast. We needed more cash flow, so I took out a loan against my condo. When that wasn't enough, I sold the place and moved into one of the hotel rooms. Ethan listened intently as Tyler continued. My brother was the numbers guy, so I trusted him with the finances. He said we needed to bring on investors and cut expenses. I didn't think twice when he handed me the paperwork. I just signed it. Turned out I had signed away my share of the business. Next thing I knew, everything I had was on the curb. My own brother kicked me out. Ethan's heart sank. Your brother? What's his name? He asked cautiously. Tyler hesitated before answering. Noah, he said. The name hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Noah's your brother? He whispered, barely able to process what he was hearing. Tyler frowned. Yeah, why? Do you know him? Ethan nodded slowly. He's my dad. The two men sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then, to Ethan's surprise, Tyler started laughing. Well, I'll be damned, he said, shaking his head. I've got a nephew. Ethan didn't know what to say. He had always known his father could be ruthless, but hearing what he had done to Tyler, his own brother, was too much. It confirmed everything Ethan had ever feared about Mark. I'm so sorry, Ethan said finally. Tyler shrugged. It's not your fault, kid, but now you know what kind of man he really is. Ethan felt a surge of anger and determination. He couldn't let his father's actions define his family. He and Tyler talked for hours that night, sharing their stories and dreams. When they finally parted ways, Ethan had a plan. The next day, he returned to work at the hotel as if nothing had changed. He didn't tell Mark about Tyler, and he certainly didn't mention the shelter. Instead, he worked harder than ever, saving every tip and carefully plotting his next move. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make a difference. Not just for himself, but for Tyler, the shelter, and everyone his father had written off. He couldn't change Mark, but he could prove that kindness and compassion were stronger than greed. What Ethan didn't realize was that his quiet rebellion was about to set off a chain of events that would shake his father's empire to its core. Ethan sat in his room that night, scrolling through Reddit. It was his refuge when life at home became too heavy to bear. The anonymous camaraderie of strangers gave him the courage to share what was on his mind. With his heart pounding, he typed up his story, how he'd grown up valuing kindness, how his mother's influence had shaped him, and how his father, Mark, had tried to crush those values after her death. He shared the discovery about Tyler being his uncle, the betrayal his father had committed, and how he was secretly saving his hotel tips to make a difference. Finally, he ended with a question. Am I wrong for defying my father and continuing to support people in need, even if it means going against everything he stands for? Ethan hit post and waited. Within minutes, the comments started pouring in, and the community rallied around him. Comment 1. From user @HeartForHumanity. Ethan, your story broke my heart. I'm so sorry you've had to carry this weight alone. What your father did to Tyler is absolutely unforgivable. But the fact that you're standing up for what's right proves you're nothing like him. Your mother would be so proud of the person you've become. Keep saving those tips and helping people. It's your way of honoring her memory. Comment 2. From user at JusticeWarrior77. This story hits close to home for me. My dad is also the tough love type, and he never understood why I wanted to work in nonprofits instead of joining his business. It's not easy, but you have to live your life according to your own values. You're already showing more courage than most people ever will. Just be careful. If your dad finds out about the tips, he might try to stop you. Comment 3. From user at Hotel Rebel. Ethan, you're a rock star. The fact that you're quietly saving your tips to help others shows how strong your character is. But here's my advice. Think long term. If you want to really stick it to your dad, you need a plan. Build alliances, save as much as you can, and make sure you don't burn out in the process. This isn't just about helping others, it's about proving to yourself that you can rise above his toxic legacy. Ethan read every comment, his emotions oscillating between gratitude and validation. These strangers didn't know him, yet they understood him in a way his father never had. Each word of encouragement strengthened his resolve. But a comment from Heart for Humanity stuck with him the most. Your mother would be so proud. He hadn't thought about it in those terms before. Every time Mark belittled him or accused him of being weak, he felt a surge of shame. But now, Ethan realized he wasn't weak. He was living out his mother's legacy. Still, Ethan knew this path wouldn't be easy. If Mark ever found out about the money he was funneling to the shelter, there would be hell to pay. For now, Ethan would stay under the radar. He'd keep working at the hotel, collecting tips and saving quietly, but deep down, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that a confrontation with his father was inevitable. Mark's grip on the family was firm, but Ethan was beginning to see the cracks in the foundation. He couldn't let this toxic cycle continue, not for himself and not for Tyler. He didn't know exactly how it would happen, but Ethan was determined to stand up to Mark and show him the power of kindness. As Ethan closed his laptop, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. His story was resonating with others, and their support gave him the strength to keep moving forward. Little did he know, the events that would unfold in the coming weeks would test his courage and resolve like never before. Ethan continued to carry the weight of his secret as he worked at the hotel. Each shift felt heavier than the last, not just because of the physical demands, but because of the knowledge he now had about his father's betrayal. He couldn't look at Mark the same way. Every time his father walked past him in the grand lobby, dressed in his tailored suit and barking orders at staff, Ethan's resentment grew. Despite the growing tension, Ethan clung to the encouragement he had received from the Reddit community. The comments had strengthened his resolve, but they had also planted a seed of fear. What would happen if Mark discovered what he was doing? Could he afford to risk everything to help Tyler and the shelter? One Saturday, while Ethan was off duty, Tyler called him out of the blue. "Hey, Ethan," Tyler said hesitantly. "Do you have some time to meet? There's something I need to talk to you about." Ethan agreed immediately, sensing that this wasn't just a casual conversation. They decided to meet at a small park near the shelter. When Ethan arrived, he found Tyler sitting on a bench, staring at the ground. "Is everything okay?" Ethan asked, sitting down beside him. Tyler hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other night, about Noah." He paused, his jaw tightening. "There's something you need to know. Your dad didn't just take my share of the business, he ruined my life." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Tyler took a deep breath. "When I started working with Noah, I trusted him completely. He was my brother. I never thought he'd betray me, but he didn't just trick me into signing over the business. He went behind my back and used my name to take out loans. Loans I never knew about until creditors started coming after me. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I lost everything, my home, my car, my savings." Ethan stared at Tyler, horrified. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why didn't you take legal action?" Tyler laughed bitterly. "I tried, but Noah's a master manipulator. He had the resources, the connections, and the lawyers to bury me. I couldn't fight him. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. His father's actions weren't just cruel, they were calculated. This wasn't the man his mother had married. This was someone else entirely, someone Ethan barely recognized. "I'm sorry, Tyler," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "You didn't deserve any of this." Tyler shook his head. "It's not your fault, kid, but I needed you to know the full story. You have a right to know what kind of man your father is." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He wanted to help Tyler, but he didn't know how. The money he was saving from his tips felt like a drop in the ocean compared to the damage his father had caused. Over the next few days, Ethan found it harder and harder to keep his emotions in check. Every time Mark gave him an order or dismissed him with a curt comment, Ethan had to bite his tongue to keep from lashing out. But the breaking point came one evening when Mark summoned him to his office. Ethan stepped into the large, opulent room, the smell of leather and expensive cologne overwhelming his senses. Mark was sitting behind his massive oak desk, a stack of papers in front of him. "Sit down," Mark said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Ethan complied, his stomach churning. "I've noticed you've been distracted lately," Mark said, his tone sharp. "Your performance is slipping. Do I need to remind you that working here is a privilege? That I'm doing you a favor by letting you work in my hotel?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "A favor? You're the one who forced me to work here," he shot back before he could stop himself. Mark's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, Ethan. I've put a roof over your head, food on your plate, and given you opportunities most kids your age could only dream of. A little gratitude wouldn't hurt." Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. Gratitude? For what? For turning your back on people who need help? For betraying your own brother? Mark froze, his expression darkening. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," Ethan said, his voice rising. "I know what you did to Tyler. I know how you stole his share of the business, how you left him with nothing, and you have the nerve to call yourself a success?" Mark stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled. "Tyler was irresponsible. He didn't have what it took to run a business. I did what needed to be done." "No," Ethan said, standing to meet his father's glare. "You destroyed him. You ruined his life. And for what? Money? Power? Is that all you care about?" Mark's jaw clenched. "I built this business from the ground up. I didn't have time to babysit my brother. If you're so desperate to defend him, maybe you should join him at that shelter you're so fond of." Ethan's heart was pounding, but he refused to back down. "Maybe I will," he said. "At least they understand what it means to care about people." Mark laughed coldly. "You think you're better than me? You don't know the first thing about running a business, about making hard decisions. You're just a naive kid who doesn't understand how the world works." Ethan didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the office, his father's words echoing in his ears. But instead of feeling defeated, he felt something else: determination. He was done trying to earn his father's approval. It was time to take a stand, not just for himself, but for Tyler and for everyone else his father had wronged. Ethan didn't know how yet, but he was going to make things right. After the explosive confrontation with his father, Ethan felt a mix of adrenaline and dread. He had finally stood up to Mark, exposing the cruelty and greed that had plagued their family for years. But now, the weight of what he had done settled on him. The tension in their home became unbearable. Mark barely spoke to him, and when he did, it was curt and filled with resentment. Ethan knew the fallout wasn't over. He could feel it looming like a storm on the horizon. That night, Ethan returned to Reddit to share an update with the community. He described how he confronted his father, the anger in Mark's voice, and the defiance he felt when he walked out of the office. He didn't sugarcoat his fear or uncertainty, but he also expressed a newfound sense of determination. Ethan ended his post with a question. Did I go too far? Or was this the stand I needed to take? The community didn't hold back. Comments flooded in, offering advice, support, and personal stories of similar struggles. Ethan scrolled through, grateful for the outpouring of encouragement. Comment 1. From user at Stand for Truth. Ethan, you absolutely did the right thing. Sometimes, the only way to get through to people like your father is to confront them head-on. He's been using his power to manipulate and hurt others for too long. You've shown more courage than most adults I know. Keep standing your ground, but be careful. Men like your dad don't take challenges lightly. Stay smart and stay strong. Comment 2. From user Family Matters 88. This hit me hard. My dad and I had a similar dynamic. He never respected my values because they didn't align with his idea of success. It's not easy standing up to someone who has so much control over your life, but you're proving that you have integrity. Your mom would be so proud of you. Just remember, you're not alone in this. There's a whole community here that's got your back. Ethan reread the comments several times, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. These strangers believed in him, in his fight for what was right. Their words reminded him that this battle wasn't just about him. It was about doing what his mother had always taught him, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. For now, he would keep his head down, saving every dollar he earned and keeping his plans to himself. But he knew he couldn't stay quiet forever. Mark had built his empire on the backs of others, and Ethan was determined to make sure his father finally faced the consequences of his actions. What Ethan didn't realize yet was just how far Mark would go to protect his legacy and how much it would test Ethan's resolve. Ethan felt like he was living in a pressure cooker. Every day at the hotel was a test of his patience and willpower. Mark had grown colder since their confrontation, his eyes filled with disdain whenever they crossed paths. Ethan had seen his father angry before, but this was different. There was a sharpness, a venom, that hadn't been there before. It was as if Mark viewed him as more than just a disobedient son. He was now an enemy. Despite the tension, Ethan pressed on. He worked diligently, carrying luggage, smiling at guests, and saving every dollar of his tips. His secret trips to the shelter continued on weekends when Mark was away on business. Each visit reminded him why he was doing this: to honor his mother's values and to make a real difference. But the weight of his double life was exhausting. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was watching, waiting for him to slip up. One Friday evening, as Ethan was cleaning up the front desk area, Mark called him into his office. The air was heavy as Ethan walked in, his father seated behind his massive desk, papers strewn in front of him. "Sit down," Mark said sharply. Ethan complied, trying to keep his nerves in check. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying him. "I've been hearing things, Ethan," he said. "Strange things. Rumors about where you've been spending your time on weekends." Ethan's heart sank, but he kept his face neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied calmly. Mark's lips curled into a smirk. "Don't play dumb with me. I know you've been sneaking off to that shelter." Ethan's stomach tightened. He'd been careful, but clearly not careful enough. "So what if I have?" he said, his voice steady. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Mark slammed his hand on the desk, making Ethan flinch. "Not doing anything wrong? You're wasting time and money on people who will never amount to anything, and worse, you're undermining me. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? My own son, running around playing hero for a bunch of freeloaders." Ethan's hands balled into fists. "They're not freeloaders," he snapped. "They're people who need help, something you'd never understand." Mark's face turned crimson. "Watch your tone," he growled. "You live under my roof, you work in my hotel, and you will not embarrass me. If I catch you at that shelter again, you're out. Do you hear me? Out." Ethan stared at his father, his heart pounding. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Maybe I don't want to live under your roof," he said quietly, "and maybe I don't care about your hotel or your reputation. I'm done letting you control me." Mark's eyes narrowed. "You walk out that door, Ethan, and you're no son of mine." Ethan felt the sting of those words, but he didn't let it show. "You stopped being my father a long time ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mark fuming behind him. That night, Ethan packed a small bag and left the house. He didn't have a plan, just a gut feeling that he couldn't stay any longer. He made his way to the shelter, where Linda greeted him with a worried expression. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked. He hesitated, the weight of everything crashing down on him. I need somewhere to stay," he admitted. Linda nodded without hesitation. You can stay here for now, she said. We'll figure it out together. Ethan spent the next few weeks sleeping in a small cot at the shelter and working alongside the other volunteers. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. For the first time he was free from Mark's control, free to live according to his own values. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality of his situation began to set in. Ethan missed his room, his routine, and most of all, the small, lingering hope that Mark might one day understand him. One day, while Ethan was serving meals, Tyler approached him. "You okay, kid?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "I'm getting by." Tyler studied him for a moment before speaking. "Listen, I've been thinking, what if we do something bigger? Something that really makes an impact?" Ethan looked at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Tyler's eyes lit up. "I've been talking to some of the other guys here, and they're on board. We want to organize a fundraiser, something to bring in real money for the shelter, and I was hoping you'd help." Ethan felt a flicker of hope. "Of course," he said. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and organizing. Ethan threw himself into the project, pouring all his energy into making it a success. They reached out to local businesses, created flyers, and even got a few local musicians to agree to perform. The night of the fundraiser, the shelter was packed. Ethan stood at the back of the room, watching as people mingled, laughed, and donated. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of purpose, a reminder of why he was doing this. As the event wound down, Linda approached him. "Ethan, you should be proud," she said. "We raised more money tonight than we've ever seen before." Ethan smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't felt in a long time. But as he looked around the room, he couldn't help but wonder if Mark had heard about the fundraiser, and if he'd ever truly understand the man Ethan was becoming. Ethan stood in the shelter's kitchen, looking around at the people he now called his second family. The fundraiser had been a massive success, but it wasn't just the money they'd raised that gave Ethan a sense of fulfillment. It was the overwhelming support, the shared laughter, and the collective hope that had filled the room that night. He had stepped away from his father's shadow and was finally living a life that aligned with his values. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Ethan had learned a lot over the past few months, lessons he would carry with him forever. The first was that standing up for what you believe in, even when it feels impossible, is always the right choice. Confronting his father had been terrifying, but it was a necessary step in reclaiming his identity. By refusing to compromise his morals, Ethan had found a strength he didn't know he had. Another profound lesson was the power of kindness. Ethan had seen firsthand how small acts of generosity could ripple outward, changing lives in ways he never expected. Whether it was serving meals at the shelter or organizing a fundraiser, each action reminded him of his mother's words. The smallest act of kindness can change someone's world. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: family isn't always defined by blood. Ethan's relationship with his father had been fractured, but through Tyler and the people at the shelter, he had found a new kind of family, a community built on mutual support and compassion. Of course, the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, nights when Ethan wondered if he'd made the right choices. But every time he felt that creeping uncertainty, he reminded himself of the faces he had helped, the lives he had touched. He realized that true success wasn't measured by wealth or status, but by the impact you leave on others. As Ethan's story comes to a close, it's clear that this isn't just about one young man standing up to his father. It's about all of us. It's about finding the courage to live authentically, to fight for what matters, and to build a better world one act of kindness at a time. What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? Have you ever had to take a stand against someone in your life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next story. And as always, thank you for being part of our community. Your support means the world to us. Let's continue spreading kindness, one story at a time. See you in the next video.